Welcome everyone! Put your dinner pails under your desk and wipe your slates clean. We're about to go back in time to the 19th century, when students learned in stuffy one-room buildings from teachers not much older than they were. Schools were by subscription. Public schools were strengthened with the Ohio School Act of 1853. This act made the township separate districts and created school subdistricts. By 1879, there were 143 township schools in Clermont County. The era of the one-room schoolhouse finally came to an end with the consolidation of school districts in the 1930s, and by 1936, only 16 one-room schools were still in operation. This is a reconstruction of the first known one-room schoolhouse in Ohio, in Schönbrunn Village, originally built in 1772 in New Philadelphia, Ohio. Because children were needed to help in the fields, schools were open for a few months a year, usually in the summer. Most students did not obtain any higher than an 8th grade level of education, and many never even graduated. There were no laws requiring students to go to school during this era because parents often needed their children to help with farm chores. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, one-room schoolhouses were the norm in rural areas. A single teacher taught grades 1 through 8 together. The youngest students, called ABCdarians because they would learn their ABCs, sat in the front, while the oldest sat in the back. The room was heated by a single wood stove. Students used a slate and chalk to write things down, and the teacher sometimes had a larger one affixed to the back wall. Many of these schools were added to the subdistricts between the 1850s and 1880s, but the buildings themselves may be older than the creation of the school subdistricts. The Elk Lick Schoolhouse is no longer standing. It once stood on Elk Lick Road, but it was destroyed by arson on Halloween night, 1931. The site itself, along with much of the town, is now under the water of Harsha Lake at East Fork State Park. The Whitter One-room Schoolhouse was located on Amelia Olive Branch Road. The school became part of the Amelia Rural Local Consolidated School District in 1931, and later it became the Batavia Township Hall. This 1917 picture shows teacher Lydia Burrs. Henry Clark Corbin, who fought in the American Civil War in the 83rd Ohio Infantry as a second lieutenant and eventually rose to become lieutenant general, once taught school here. It is currently a home. The Lucy Run one-room schoolhouse in Hamlet, Ohio was built in 1885. Lucy Run was in School Subdistrict No. 4 in Batavia Township. It is also now a home. In the 1800s, there was no transportation to get to school. Most schoolhouses were built to serve students living within 4 or 5 miles, which was considered close enough for them to walk. At some schools, boys and girls entered through separate doors and were also kept separate for lessons. Shiloh School in Goshen Township is also now a home. The school year was much shorter back then. When the Department of Education first began gathering data on the subject in the 1869 to 1870 school year, students attended school for about 132 days. Just for reference, the standard school year these days is about 180. This, of course, depended on when they were needed to help their families harvest the crops. Attendance was just 59%, compared to these days, which is almost 100. School days typically started at 9 a.m. and wrapped up at either 2 p.m. or 4 p.m., depending on the area. There was 1 hour for recess and lunch, which was called nooning. Pictured here is the former Utopia school in Franklin Township, which is now a home. Lessons were quite different than what they are today. Teachers taught subjects including reading, writing, arithmetic, history, grammar, rhetoric, and geography. Students would memorize their lessons, and the teacher would bring them to the front of the room as a class to recite what they had learned, so that the teacher could correct them on things like pronunciation on the spot, while other students continued to work behind them. This former one-room schoolhouse in Pierce Township is empty and abandoned. Some of the historical one-room schools that survive today remain unrestored and in disrepair. Teachers sometimes lived with their students' families. According to Michael Day at the Country School Association of America, this practice was called boarding round, and it often involved the teacher moving from one student's house to the next as often as every week. One Wisconsin teacher wrote of boarding with families in 1851 and wrote, "I found it very unpleasant, especially during the winter and spring terms. For 1 week I would board where I would have a comfortable room. The next week my room would be so open that the snow would blow in, and sometimes I would find it on my bed and also in it. A part of the places where I boarded had flannel sheets to sleep in, and the others cotton. But the most unpleasant part was being obliged to walk through the snow and water. I suffered much from colds and a cough." The Branch Hills Schoolhouse in Miami Township was added to Clermont County's 5th Subdistrict in 1880. It is now a church. Discipline back then was very strict. Sure, stepping out of line in the 1800s and early 1900s could result in detention, suspension, or expulsion, but it could also result in a lashing. According to a document outlining student and teacher rules created by the Board of Education in Franklin, Ohio from 1883, pupils may be detained at any recess or not exceeding 15 minutes after the hour for closing the afternoon session, when the teacher deems such detention necessary for the commitment of lessons or for the enforcement of discipline. Whenever it shall become necessary for teachers to resort to corporal punishment, the same shall not be inflicted upon the head or hands of the pupil. Not all places had such a rule, though. In other areas, teachers could use a ruler or a pointer to lash a student's knuckles or palms. Other punishments including holding a heavy book for more than an hour and writing, "I will not do a certain activity" on the blackboard 100 times. The former Marathon School in Jackson Township is now a storage building. For many, education ended just after 8th grade. In order to graduate, students would have to pass a final exam. Questions included, name the parts of speech and define those that have no modifications. A wagon box is 2 feet deep, 10 feet long, and 3 feet wide. How many bushels of wheat will it hold? As well as, what are elementary sounds? How are they classified? How would you do on those questions today? The Camp Dennison School was built in 1864 after the conclusion of the Civil War and was occupied from 1870 to 1952. It was one of the first 2-room, 2-story brick schools built in the Midwest, and it is now a restaurant. No lunch was provided by the school, even if families had the money for it, so children brought their lunches to school in metal pails. Every student drank water from a bucket filled by the older boys using the same tin cup. As of 2017, 400 one-room schoolhouses still operated in the United States. Although education has changed quite a bit, we owe a lot to the teachers and educators of years past. Thank you for joining me, and have a wonderful day.